So, the title of my paper is Mightier Than Machete: The Representation of Violence in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Sky, Beloved, and Sula. Now, I would like to begin with a little bit of a theorization of the concept of violence, then try to relate violence to the specifically because it's Morrison, racial violence, community violence, individual violence, as reflected in the stated narratives. Okay, and I hope that I won't bore you. Okay, so to start with, violence in literature refers to the recurrent use of violence as a storytelling motif in classic and contemporary literature. Depending on the nature of the narrative, violence can be represented either through graphic descriptions, psychological, and emotional suffering. Violence is depicted for diverse reasons in literature: to symbolize a societal, psychological, or philosophical phenomena, as conflict is an essential element of narration that creates the tension necessary to advance the sequence of actions. Unresolved conflicts, regardless of the type, can result in violence. Fiction maintains the depictions of violence as inherently violent and expresses violence as a result of conflict. Why do violence and
Ma'am, your voice is actually stuck. Um, I think you need to maybe
I think there's some network issue from
which is
ma'am.
termed
yeah, yeah. Now you're audible,
okay.
ma'am. So just go back maybe 2 or 3 lines, yeah, and start from there.
Oh, yeah. I'll just put my mic closer to. So is it fine now? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
ma'am. Yes.
So in a variety of dystopian works, the humans are portrayed as aggressors, and this phenomenon is termed ecocide, as we all know, defined as mass destruction of the environment through intentional or neglectful behavior. Ecocide by immoderate resource exploitation as well as human, caused climate change and life extinction is displayed not as a background event but the root cause of apocalyptic scenarios in modern speculative novels such as Octavia Butler's science fiction novel Parable of the Sower. From a psychodynamic perspective, aggression is a natural human instinct, as is the desire for pleasure. According to Freud, violence happens as an expression of the id and superego. And what we find is the understanding of internal conflict is commonly used in storytelling for character building. To come to the idea of racial violence, it broadly encompasses acts of aggression, intimidation, and harm motivated by prejudice based on a person's race or ethnicity. It can manifest in various forms, from physical assaults and hate crimes to systemic discrimination and microaggressions. Racial hatred is intricately connected with the concept of otherhood. Now, in the second segment of my lecture, I would like to talk about otherhood, which we know is unarguably linked with the question of difference that plays a crucial role in the construction of social and political identities. The other, as understood in theoretical terms, is an essentialist Eurocentric formulation that is utilized to highlight the deficiencies that are conceptually located in the black racial entity. In fact, in the relational equation between the white and the black races, the black is almost always positioned as the other to the central Eurocentric notion of self. Difference as a concept primarily refers to racial inequalities that result in relationships of subordination and domination. Very often in race relations, particularly in delineating the oppositions between the white and black races, there has been a tendency to construe the other as negative. The linking together of the four ideas, black, other, sinner, dangerous, runs through all manifestations of medieval Christian thought. Such conceptual notions about blackness can be traced to diverse socio-historical, economic, and political processes of exploitation, segregation, and marginalization in the history of white civilization. The development of racism is related in a pronounced manner to the historical experience of slavery, colonialism, and other institutions of white supremacy. The American blacks can be seen as the offshoots of an oppressive slave trade and forced settlements. Undoubtedly, the enslavement of innumerable people of African origin and their transportation to the Americas constitutes one of the most crucial historical roots of racism in the United States. The transportation of slaves from West Africa to the Americas came to be known as the infamous Middle Passage. Life was harsh, even hellish for the plantation slaves in the American South, and their agony began with the Middle Passage. In the early days, the voyage across the stormy Atlantic took over 6 months, and the human cargo of hundreds of captives packed tightly together in the holds, shackled and abused, was a horrifying experience. The death rate aboard the slaves was high due to malnutrition, disease, and suicides, while the rebellious captives were killed. The massacre of over 100 Africans on the British slaver Zong in 1781 and the brutal suppression of an African revolt aboard the Spanish slaver La Amistad in 1839, from which Spielberg made his film Amistad, you are all aware, greatly spurred the cause of the abolitionists who wished to eradicate slavery. Now, in the broader context of racism in USA, mass racial violence consisted of ethnic conflicts and race riots. Radically based targeted attacks against African Americans by white Americans took place before the American Civil War, often in relation to attempted slave revolts, and racially based attacks against African Americans by white Americans took place after the war also, in relation to tensions which existed during the Reconstruction and later efforts to suppress black suffrage and institute Jim Crow laws. In the early 20th century, African American culture underwent a series of radical transformations that freed black writers from the reactive postures of the segregation era and encouraged innovative articulations of modernist African and diasporic traditions. Sparked by the great migration from the rural South to the industrial North, impressive flowerings of cultural activity took place in Harlem and Chicago, attracting writers from throughout the continent with the promise of larger inter and intra-racial audiences. The artists of the age investigated in a plurality of ways the possibilities of Marxism, modernist aesthetics, and woman centered cultural activity that gave rise to a conscious tradition of African American feminism. The most influential text of the early 20th century, and we just cannot gloss over this part, is W.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk, defined, which defined the crucial issues that have elicited serious intellectual and artistic responses. Identifying the central concern of the new century as the problem of the color line, Du Bois defined the phenomenon of double consciousness, the awareness enforced by oppressive institutions and stereotypes of one's self. And I would like to quote a particular section, a very, very, touching pronouncement made by Du Bois in his essay, The Strivings of the Negro People, and after that, The Souls of the Black Folk, where he argued that the black could never see himself as himself. He saw himself through the eyes of the white man. And I quote, after the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One even feels his two-ness: an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. The history of the American Negro is a history of this strife, this longing to attain self conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. He would not Africanize American, for America has too much to teach to the world, and Africa, he would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in their face. Unquote. So, Dubois proposed to resolve the problem through the encouragement of a distinctive African genius reflected in the rich verbal and oral tradition manifested in songs, stories, verbal games, sermons, all of which provided proof of great articulateness among African Americans. And traditional African American culture can be divided into the categories of customary or behavioral folklore, material folklore, oral folklore. I'm not going into the details of that, but I'm coming specifically to Morrison. But before that, you all know the Harlem Renaissance. It was only in the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro movement that poets, dramatists, writers of fiction, painters, musicians, intellectuals assembled to create an environment of cultural exchange. Alan Locke, in his essay The New Negro, sought to direct the spirit of unrest in the black communities towards creation and display of talented art, which would become the black ticket into white America. Locke inspired the blacks to produce the uncompromising art essential to the reconstruction of African American identity. Sterling Allen Brown enumerated some themes for the artists of Harlem Renaissance. For example, Africa as a source of racial pride, Black American heroes, racial political propaganda, Black folk tradition, and candid self revelation. Now, though the black male artists were making their foray into the domain of fiction and poetry and drama and various other arts, the marginalization of the women was remarkable. As you are all aware, Bell Hooks, the famous in the domain of feminist criticism, observes that no other group in America has so had their identity socialized out of existence as have black women. We are rarely recognized as a group separate and distinct from black men or as present part of the large group women in this culture. When black people are talked about, sexism militates against the acknowledgement of the interests of black women. When women are talked about, racism militates against a recognition of black female interests. When black people are talked about, the focus tends to be on the black man. And when women are talked about, the focus tends to be on white woman. Nowhere is it more evident than on the vast body of feminist literature. But of course, we do know that with the upsurge of feminist writers or new writers coming up, we have had very eminent right practitioners such as Zora Neale Hurston. Okay, their eyes were watching God, and many other things. Anne Petries, The Street, Paul Marshall's Praise Song for the Widow, Gwendolyn Brooks, Maud Martha, Alice Walker's Meridian, and The Color Purple. You have June Jordan, Sonia Sanchez, Lucille Clifton, Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou's poem Phenomenal Woman celebrates black women's unique strength. Gloria Naylor, Toni Kate Bambara, and certainly Toni Morrison. Now, Morrison's novels have attracted both popular and critical attention for their inventive blend of realism and fantasy, unsparing social analysis. The combination of social observation with broadening and allusive commentary gives her fictions a symbolic dimension. All of Morrison's characters exist in a world defined by its blackness and by the surrounding white society that both violates and denies it. She rarely depicts white characters, for the brutality here is less a single act than the systematic denial of the reality of Black lives. Instead of portraying the Black person as invisible in white life, she immerses her readers in the concrete, vivid, vibrant world of the Black community. The Black subculture. Now I come to the first novel, that is The Bluest Eye. You find in the novel that the Black subculture is represented through the deficiencies of the Black American family, which is positioned as the other to reinforce the stereotype of the empowered white family. So, as opposed to Claudia's house, which is old, cold, and grim, at night a kerosene lamp lights one large room, the others are braced in darkness. The White House is green and white. It has a red door. It is very pretty. In Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, violence is a pervasive and central theme, manifesting in various forms, including physical, sexual, psychological violence, all deeply intertwined with racism and sexism. The Breedlove family's sense of utter hopelessness and helplessness is externalized in their appearance. Both literal and spiritual poverty manifest themselves in ugliness in a world in which beauty is equated with success, poverty with ugliness. To some extent, this problem is an inseparable, ongoing process. It's an ontological experience. Morrison makes it clear that this ontological problem is vastly complicated in the context of a society based on coercive power relations. It is this power running through all capillaries of social structure that renders Jolie Breedlove and Pauline Breedlove so helpless and powerless. The power hierarchy rests so heavily on the hearts of the young recipients of oppression that the entire process and structure of oppression are taken as natural. Power relations can have a similar effect on community as a whole. The look of the white society, supported by all kinds of material domination, freezes the black individual and also classifies all blacks alike, freezing the group. They become a no object before the gaze of the third. Pecola, as the representative of the marginalized oppression, is completely denied access to any apparatus of power in society. Right. Now, Michel Foucault, as you all know in Power and Knowledge, observes, and I quote, power must be analyzed as something which circulates, or rather as something which only functions in the form of a chain. It is never localized here or there, never in anybody's hands, never appropriated as a commodity or piece of wealth. Power is employed and exercised through a net like organization. And not only do individuals circulate through its threads, they are always in the position of simultaneously undergoing and exercising this power. They are not its inert or consenting target. They are always also the elements of its articulation. In other words, individuals are vehicles of power, not its points of application. Unquote. A prominent instance of psychological aggression is highlighted when, for the first time, the mother, Pauline Breedlove, gives birth to her child. She works in a white household as a governess, and she's used to see the white children so beautifully dressed and so prim and proper. And when her child is born, you look at her at the at an unrecognizable feeling of unjustified hatred. And I quote from the novel, she looks at her child for the first time. This should be a moment of joy, but she says, eyes all soft and wet, a cross between a puppy and a dying man. But I knew she was ugly. Her head full of pretty hair, but Lord, she was ugly. What's she doing? She's looking at her own self in the form of her daughter and pronouncing that she is ugly. Pecola's first perception is her mother's reflection of her ugliness. From the seed of that initial negation grows her subsequent fears. This sense of self negation is rooted in what Lewis Gordon calls absence. And we find that this absence is very pronounced because the mother is never available to the child. The mother is never there in the household to look after the child. Okay, she's always absent. So, um, as I want to quote from Lewis Gordon, he says, in an anti-black world, blackness signifies absence, the absence of identity in a full sense of a self, a perspective, or a standpoint with its own self-referential point of view. Claudia, on the other hand, Pecola's friend, is very conscious of the perversity of this position and its roots in racial society. As a thinking subject, she recognizes the diversion of feeling from herself and the world into white values, emphasized by repeated references because they were lovable to everyone but her. Claudia knew even as a child the force of alien cultural images are very, very repulsive. Her first reaction now, Claudia, what does she do? This is also a very disturbing episode. Now, children are all fond of dolls, especially the girl child is fond of the doll and plays with the doll. And the concept of the doll in white America in those days was the white doll with its locks of golden hair and its blue eyes, which is why it's related to the symbolic title of Morrison's novel. So Claudia is so annoyed with the idea of the white standards of beauty. What she does is she just destroys the doll in a you know destroys, takes it out, tears it into pieces in a very, very unusual manner, because the doll signifies beauty. The doll is such a beautiful thing. What she does, why she does this, is Claudia's destruction of the doll is a complex response which requires us to understand how Western culture inspires hatred towards and among people of African descent, including destructive behaviors, violence, and an equally adverse disconnection from anything non Western. In removing various parts of the doll, Claudia dismantles the structure which constitutes and sustains it as an embodiment of white beauty, an emblem of white beauty. Claudia's obsession with discovering the source of superiority of white culture leads her initially to torture the white girls also, whom the dolls represent. But later, she recoils in horror from this disinterested violence. It's not that she wants to hurt the individual girls, she wants to hurt the concept of whiteness represented by the external beauty of those girls. Morrison makes an effective contrast between the ideal sanitized family of Dick and Jane, the family which Pauline looks after, and the Breedlove's quarrelsome and violent marriage. Mrs. Breedlove finds zest and passion in her formalized battles with her husband, while he projects onto her a sense of an innate inferiority arising from the way he has been treated by the whites. Whilst Claudia tries to dismember the white doll to discover the nature of white superiority, Pecola regularly stares into her mirror, trying to discover the secret of the ugliness that made her ignored or despised at school by teachers and classmates alike. The irony is that the secret is not going to be found within herself, but within the culture that defines her as ugly. The focus of the novel is on the nature of aggression expressed through a racialized concept of beauty, which Pecola sees in the eyes of the shopkeeper, Mr. Yakoboksi, the total absence of human recognition, the glazed separateness. Pecola disturbs Geraldine because she represents disorder. Hair uncombed, the hair uncombed, dresses falling apart, shoes untied, caked with dirt. Geraldine's final words to Pecola are, "Get out, you nasty little black bitch, get out of my house." Another disturbing figure of the outcast in the novel is Choli Bridlove, with his yellow eyes, flaring nostrils, reminiscent of Shadrach in Sula, the only black who could curse the white people and get away with it. Sun in Tarbaby also represents wildness. He's described as someone who emerges plain out of wildness. Sikso in Beloved is yet another manifestation of this same outlaw wilderness. Characters like Choli are inevitably hunted down, separated from family and community, or even destroyed. Their function is almost that of the pariah, like Cain's banishment. Terry Orton observes that in all Morrison's novels, alienation from community or the village invariably leads to dire consequences. Unquote. Choli is an outdoor character. As Cynthia Davis points out, the characters who are outdoors are cut off from everything, profoundly frightening to the community, especially to a community dispossessed and peripheral. It responds by treating the free person as another kind of scapegoat, using that excess to define its own life. The outlaw Choli is already excluded by his ugliness and his poverty, having always been outdoors. been, outlawed, outraged, outrageous, out of control. He has raped his own daughter, who gives birth to his baby and goes mad at the end. Choli fails to protect also his beloved darling from the White Hunters, his girlfriend. The desire to protect her was a desire to protect himself as her protector. Right. So all he can do to restore his selfhood is to deny hers further. Morrison effectively portrays the displacement of male humiliation onto the only person left that a black man can own, the black woman. The black woman, doubly other, is the perfect scapegoat. The violence that Morrison recreates in her novels is based on stark historical fact and reality. It is reminiscent of the trauma of the Jewish Holocaust. As Robert J. Lifton observes, and I quote, the problem is an impairment in the general capacity to recreate viable forms, to bring imagination to bear upon the unpalatable, existential, historical truths, to expand the limits of that imagination, to overcome psychic numbing, and in Merton Buber's words, to imagine the real. Coming to the next novel for analysis, Beloved, sorry, Sula. It stands out for the striking manner in which violence as a motive of rebellion is delineated. The first motive of violence is presented through the character of Shadrach, who resembles the figure of a trickster. The trickster figure, as you know, according to Henry Louis Gates Jr., is usually a male characterized by individuality, satire, parody, irony, magic, indeterminacy, open endedness, ambiguity, disruption and reconciliation, betrayal and loyalty. He is essential and amoral being who flouts the most sacred taboos with impunity. In Sula, Shadrach's outrageous behavior alienates all his fellows and he is left alone as an outcast from society. Such tricksters abound in folk tales. Some examples: the medieval French story of Reynard the Fox, or the African American story of Brer Rabbit. Patrick McMurphy of Ken Casey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So, the fluid model of the self that characterizes the trickster acknowledges the undifferentiated present within every individual, which directs us to the issue of unpredictability. Shadrach focuses the reader's attention on the reality of the war. Now, the war itself is very violent, right? A phenomenon of striking significance beyond the apparently peaceful ambience of Delhi. I hope I'm audible. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, you are
Because
audible.
sometimes there are little disturbances. So, war is associated not only with destruction but with inexplicable violence, leading to the loss of lives and identity. Shadrach analogizes a key theme in the novel because his fear of death and the First World War battlefield are inexplicable and unpredictable. He invents a national suicide day in order to contain and control his fear. If one day a year were devoted to death, everybody could get out of the fear of death and the rest of the year would be safe and free. This is his logic, which is absolutely a grand illusion. The narrative and character development is built on a string of unprecedented episodes. Aksula is one of the novels where violence is rampant. You know, aggression is rampant, and that's not just because of white violence. In fact, there is no white violence in Sula. It's very interesting. Eva Peace, who is the matriarch in the Peace family, symbolizes the phallic mother who can destroy as well as create life. Her act of self harming now during the war, when her husband left her, she was left alone with her children, three children. She sacrificed her leg at the railway track to procure insurance money in her lonely parental journey to support the family. So she can die and kill at the same time. Let us see how. When his younger son, a drug addict, returns from war to the mother's house, Eva watches his son die a daily death. Every day he can see himself doused in alcohol, in drugs. He's a good singer, he doesn't sing, he doesn't do anything meaningful. And Eva murders him and burns him alive in his bed. In fact, as Eva pours the kerosene over his son before she lights the match, Plum feels the sensation of an eagle pouring a wet lightness over him, some kind of baptism, some kind of blessing. The fire Eva lights is as paradoxical as her love. It purifies as it destroys. As Clement defines that she is in the figure of a sorceress, the devouring mother, who haunts our dreams. She's innocent, mad, but full of badly remembered memories, guilty of unknown wrongs. She's the seductress, the heiress of all generic Eves. Unquote. As Rubinstein has suggested in the boundaries of the essay Self, Gender, Culture, and Fiction, Morrison's novels are replete with images of incest, desired or enacted, like Plum's return to the mother's womb is associated with ideas of castration, death, revelation, but paradoxically also with enlightenment and transcendence. Sula inherits you know, protagonist of the novel, inherits this rebellious aggressiveness from Eva, that is her grandmother, as she parodies an act of circumcision rite when both Nell and Sula, both are great friends, as you know. Nell and Sula are bullied by a group of white boys. Just imagine this. They come and go. They go to the school and they come back and they have some ice cream at the ice cream parlors every day. And while returning, the white boys, the minority whites, Irish whites, these adolescent boys always wait for them, not because it's a normal adolescent romantic infatuating activity, but because they are black. And they continuously disturb them. One day, this is what Sula does. Sula takes a knife and cuts off the tip of her own finger, confronting the white boys with this line, I quote, "If I can do that to myself, what do you suppose I'll do to you?" Inverted commas closed. Immediately after the ice cream parlor episode is the ritualized sacrifice of the male child, Chicken Little. Chicken Little is a little boy growing in the community, and Sula and Nell were very friendly with him. But it happens, it's absolutely unimaginable. Um, Chicken Little is, they play around with Chicken Little, and Sula takes the baby and swings him around. And in the flicker of a minute, he slips and falls into the lake, and he dies. Sula and Nell, in spite of their efforts, cannot save them. As Morrison writes, the apocalypse is Chicken Little's zone. Sula swings him over the water and lets go. The woman assembled at Chicken Little's funeral becomes, all the dead sons over there. There are many others also who becomes sweet Jesus himself, who is both son and lover, in whose downy face they could feel the oldest and most devastating pain there is, not the pain of childhood, but the remembrance of it. In Desire and Language, Kristeva refers to the non Oedipal incest that opens the eyes of a subject who is nourished by the mother. Neither animal, nor God, nor man, he is Dionysus, born a second time for having had the mother. Unquote. The artist of a culture, says Kristeva, is one who seeks maternal jouissance. And I quote, Sula is also a non participant spectator. A choric, this is my observation, I always have read and reread Sula. I find that she is a choric observer and she's a non participant spectator of accidental deaths. She doesn't have the energy or the presence of mind to go and help them out. She's so baffled by the whole thing. As in the case of Chicken Little, Sula just watches her mother burn. It's an accident, not because she was paralyzed, but we do not know why. This is no less dispassionate than Eva's self mutilation. Like Eva, Sula has no center, no speck around to grow, no ego. For that reason, she felt no compulsion to verify herself or be consistent with herself. According to Cynthia Davis, it is Sula's rejection of her mother and ultimately of Eva as well, which is that factor determining her lack of center or the splitting of the self, a denial of togetherness. Sula represents a supernatural force in the eyes of the community because everyone thinks she's devil. The plague of robins that accompanies Sula's return to her hometown after 10 years in 1937 is inexplicable and supernatural. It bears resemblance to the sudden January thaw that follows her death and leads to the death of others in the community who, in a mood of mass hysteria, enter the abandoned tunnel itself a historical artifact and testament to the inevitable failure of the white man's promises, where they were drowned, crushed, and entombed. Nature itself, in Morrison's words, can manifest evil, and evil deliberate as that of history, construed to punish and chastise. Morrison observed that she wrote about good and evil, but not in Western terms, that the ways in which a black community responds to evil differs from the ways in which another community would respond, as she says in an interview with Claudia Tate. They thought evil had a natural place in the universe. They did not wish to eradicate it, they just wished to protect themselves from it, maybe even to manipulate it. They refer to the black people. But they never wanted to kill it. They thought evil was just another aspect of life. The ways black people dealt with evil accounted, in my mind, for how they responded to a lot of other things. Evil is not an alien force, it's just a different force. That's the evil I was describing in Sula, Morrison says. A silent yet threatening symbol used in the narrative is Sula's birthmark, a birthmark. Her mark is in fact a stemmed rose, a tadpole or a snake or an ash, whatever, from her mother's burning body, all representing diverse aspects of Sula's ambiguity. Deborah E. McDowell writes that Sula's birthmark acts as a metaphor for her figurative selves, multiple identities. The marks are hieroglyphs, clue to a culture and a history, more than individual personality. Whether the mark is Pauline Breedlove's crippled foot in The Bluest Eye, Eva's missing leg in Sula, Pilate's navel-less stomach in Song of Solomon, Sun's locks, wild locks in Tar Baby, or the crossed circle branded beneath the breast of Seth's mother, or even the chokeberry tree scars in Seth's own back in Beloved. These represent membership rather than separation. If these marks distinguish a racial identity for the most chosen, are inflicted by the condition of blackness itself, by the poverty that has historically accompanied blackness, or by the institution of slavery, which marked its victims literally, figuratively, physically, and psychologically. Whether this is the mark of Cain or the bloodstain of a Passover, a curse or an anointment, it denotes a sisterhood, which in itself is a political statement, both subversive and confrontational. The only person in Medallion who recognizes Sula is Shadrach, the holy fool to Sula's witch, an incarnation of the river god of African lore. He recognizes in Sula a life principle, and her female essence contracts or at least balances his experience of war. You find that he leads the people away from their sad lives, like the Pied Piper leading away the children of the Hamlin for a bad debt. Shadrach leads great many members of the community to their deaths in the abandoned tunnel, thus not only ordering death itself, but also ridding the town of its rats, its unconscious guilt, and thus purifying it, just as Sula has done. Sula's quiet act of violence is reflected in the rejection of her grandmother's advice to make a family, finally putting her grandmother away in an old age home that is against the Afrocentric values. They always believing in having the family together, looking after the aged. These are values of Afrocentrism, like the like the evolving Indian value system. In her latent desire for aggression, she sort of revolts against the normative order of her community. She remains an outsider, and I would like to end this part by quoting Morrison describing Sula as essentially black, metaphysically black. She is the new world black, new world woman, extracting choice for choicelessness, improvisational, daring, disruptive, out of the house, outlawed, unpolished, uncontained, and uncontainable. Okay, Sula resembles a Jungian shadow that is not explained to anybody. The fourth face of the Holy Trinity, without which Father, Son, and Holy Ghost are incomplete. An unidentifiable pariah, and which Sula purifies the community and makes it whole, encloses the medallion that inspires the community's very name. And I close with a quotation from Sula. Once the source of their personal misfortune was identified, they had leave to protect and love one another. They began to cherish their husbands and wives, protect their children, repair their homes, and in general, band together against the devil in their midst. Quotation closed. Morrison's Beloved, which is the last novel, historicizes. I hope I have a little more time.
Yes, ma'am. You have 10 odd minutes, and then we can move into the Q&A
Yeah,
session.
yeah. So Morrison's Beloved historicizes the concept of motherhood against the backdrop of the experience of slavery in the African American sociocultural context. In this regard, I would like to show how the material constraints of motherhood quite inevitably differs from the romantic idealization of motherhood. The experience of enslavement is most devastating and replete with contradictions in every sense of the term. The Act of 1662 illustrates that all offsprings would inherit their slave mother's rank, turning enslaved women into valuable assets in the act of slavery. Furthermore, slave marriages had no legal standing, and slave couples had no legal rights to their children. Morrison delineates the physically tricky, emotionally trying, and materially oppressive circumstances of motherhood in her magical realist novel, Beloved. The novel is set against the backdrop of a pre capitalist black community where the only form of interaction between the African Americans and the black plantation owners is commodity and exchange. The exchange during involves the marketing of human beings during a historical period that is essentially pre industrial. Marianne Hirsch points out that the economy of slavery circumscribes not only the process of individualism and subject formulation, but also heightens and intensifies the experience of motherhood, of connection and separation. It raises questions about what it means to have a self away. It raises questions about what family means if mothers cannot own their children or themselves, they experience separation and loss all the more intensely. The story of motherhood that develops around the life of Seth, who is the central character also in the novel, is besides Beloved, is based on the historical incident within a specific context that Morrison refers to in her interview with Gloria Naylor in Southern Reviews. I do remember being obsessed by two or three little fragments of stories that I heard from different places. One was a newspaper clipping about a woman named Margaret Garner, in 1851. She lived in a little neighborhood just outside Cincinnati, and she had killed her children. She succeeded in killing one. She tried to kill the others. She said, I will not let these children live how I have lived. Unquote. White Christian abolitionist P.S. Busnett records his visit to the black slave mother in his Black Book, which was a cultural history of black oppression and survival. He brings to the fore how bewildered he was to witness the agony depicted in the countenance of the mother who has killed her child. Now, in the present narrative, Margaret Garner arrives in the skin of Seth Suggs, the slave mother who gets perpetually exposed to the oppressive mechanisms of economic exploitation. Patricia Hill Collins remarks that motherhood and racism are symbolically intertwined, and controlling the sexuality and fertility of both the African American and white woman was essential in reproducing notions of race as social and cultural entity. Even before Seth gets an opportunity to transmit life giving values to her children born in slavery, she comes to a bitter realization of her marginalized status as a slave woman despite her marriage to Hal. Hal Suggs doesn't have an opportunity to rear his children because he has to leave. This is a very common phenomena of black males leaving the children to be raised by the black mothers. This is because the racist critique is that slavery vitiated the family life, since many slave owners neither fostered Christian marriage among their slave couples nor hesitated to separate them on the auction block. The slave household often developed a fatherless, matrifocal, mother centered block. And we find that Negro females were accustomed to playing the dominant role in the family and marriage relations, and the role persisted. Seth realizes that she has to sell off her children to distant plantations. Now, this fear is beautifully and brilliantly portrayed in a play called Rachel, where the mother says, everywhere throughout the South, there are hundreds of dark mothers who live in fear, terrible, suffocating fear, whose rest by night is broken and whose joy by day, in their babies, in their hearts. Pain. Why? It would be more merciful to strangle the little things at birth. So the idea was suggested before only in a play called Rachel. And so this nation, the white Christian nation, has deliberately sets its curse upon the most beautiful, the most holy thing in life, that is motherhood. Seth has to suffer various instances of physical violation in a hostile environment. For example, she talks about a mammary rape when she's carrying the child and she's also having another child to feed. She talks about a traumatized experience when she was trying to go fast to get her child the milk to the baby girl. She writes, "Those boys came in there and took my milk. That's what they came in there for. Held me down and took it." Stealing her milk is not merely physical violence, but also an unpardonable violation. The physical escape from plantation for Seth symbolizes archetypal journeys of courage. Seth may be an allusion to Lethe, which is the river of forgetfulness in classical mythology. And she cannot forget her past as her present is intrinsically rooted in her past. Her traumatic life story reveals that worst brutality she has gone through is less a single act than the denial of the reality of their lives within the white space, even now. When Seth killed her infant daughter, she wanted to save her from the drudgery of slavery. She wanted to kill a part of herself, her own flesh and blood, to exclude it from the cycle of destruction, triggered by the human dynamics of racial oppression, which she considered worse than death. By killing her 2 year old daughter, she looked at her in a state of non being in an essentially anti black world. During the state of infanticide, Seth works against the available references of motherhood and violence while reconstructing new ones. Here, the emotional.
I'll just, I'll just, very sorry for this, but I think we are having a technical problem with the YouTube live. Just pause for a moment. Let me just get the cue from iFest. Just pause for a moment.
think we can start. NC, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Yeah, Debolina, just check the YouTube live. I think we are, I mean, it's still showing black on my screen. Just check the YouTube live.
The YouTube live is working, NC. We can go right ahead.
Okay, it is working, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. So, ma'am, just go back maybe 2, 3 lines and then continue.
Yes. Yes, I just have about 7 to 10 minutes only. Okay. So, you see, by killing her 2-year-old daughter, Seth is locked in a state of non being. And during this state of infanticide, Seth works against the available references of motherhood and violence while reconstructing new ones. Here, the emotional, psychological, and physical violence which she is subject to works as a repository to formulate a new parameter that entails nothing less than filicide, a paradoxical means of self preservation and self destruction. Is she then trying to fight trauma with another kind of trauma, protecting her daughter by annihilating herself? Alternatively, is she redefining the matrix of power and powerlessness by assuming the authorship of the child's destiny? Now, there are numerous questions that come to our mind. Um, and the question is the past that she was trying to erase comes back in the form of Beloved. Beloved reappears first as a ghost that takes over her home and drives Seth's 2 sons away, and then as a corporeal manifestation in flesh and blood, a young girl who appears to have access to her terrible history. The text, therefore, masterfully interlinks memory, pain, and rememory by bringing back the dead to life. Denver, who is Seth's only living daughter, is at ease with the infant's ghost as much as she is with the reincarnation. Even Seth seems to have come to terms with the ghost, not considering her malevolent. However, Beloved's reappearance forces her to take cognizance of the unfinished business she had left behind. The ghost is a paradoxical referent to the presence or absence of her enslaved past and her permanently fragmented present. In conversation with Denver, she poignantly foregrounds the temporal and spatial strands of a seemingly lost past. Seth and Morrison believe in the creation of certain intersections of memory and rememory as it contrives a complex, at times evasive, network of remembering. The efforts to forget them are only short lived self deceptions. The memories exist as a collective entity. Now, uh, throughout for Seth, the baby ghost reminds her of the blood on her hands. It is, however, not just her baby daughter's murder that she's reminded of. Her torments, the torments are also reminiscent of the physical violations that she underwent as a person in the plantation, in Sweet Home. The horrors of being subjected to inhuman violence at the hands of school teacher who was the owner of the farm. Now, in Beloved, therefore, trauma has an immediate and long lasting ramification. As I told you, the dead child returns to share her disappointment with her mother's act of love. Killing the child was giving her freedom from a life of absolute violence and torture, but again, forcing her to reconsider the debilitating outcome because the child had a right to live. The child had a right to live and face racial torture in her own terms, which was suddenly cut short by her mother's, torture, by her mother's, not torture, mother's infliction of the violence on her. So, what we find is here we find a subaltern killing the child. Here we come to the question of whether the subaltern can kill, and we are reminded of Gayatri Spivak's reference to Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri in her celebrated essay Can the Subaltern Speak? There we find that she describes her as a victim of self-inflicted violence, and the enunciation of victimhood can be read as a circumvented expression of agency. Baduri wanted to wrest her destiny from the hands of those whom she assumed would have the final say on her life, hence her deliberate self mutilation and as an act of protest. However, the onlookers misappropriated this act, nullifying its desired assertion of agency. Seth, an aberration, is jailed and excommunicated. She is not adjudicated as a mother, desperate to save her daughter from the horrific travails of society. She painstakingly took her children to a harmless and insulated world where no one could hurt them anymore. The precious, delicate, and beautiful extensions of her own body would remain permanently ensconced in a distant and safe space where no one could hurt them. And therefore, at the end, we find that the act of violence itself becomes an act of transcendence also. Franz Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth, looks at the redemptory benefits of violence, enacted by the colonized as a simultaneous rejection of colonialism and affirmation of the possibilities of post colonial life because it is purposeful and goal oriented. For Fanon, the colonizer's violence results in a range of mental disorders in the colonized, apart from the physical disfigurements. Fanon argued that the rule of the colonizer could be overthrown by the colonized through anti colonial violence. It could be done, in order to reinstate the colonized people's lost self respect, courage, and oppression, their sense of self worth. What happens when the oppressed channel their violence against their own people? This very violence targets one of the family members, the black woman's own children. Is this violence misplaced and might be a return as the voice of the repressed? Seth's attempt to attack a white man, mistaking him for school teacher to protect her best thing, is validating. Seth, nevertheless, cannot escape the final ramifications of violence she directs at her own infant child. Following the model of Fanon, we can say that this violence is far from redemptive because it misses its legitimate target, the colonizer per se. Nevertheless, it does take on the elements of resilience and rebellion as it determines the final word on her daughter's life and death. Beloved simultaneously critiques exclusive mother love as it asserts the necessity for black women to claim something as theirs. Similarly, Seth must kill her own daughter to claim that daughter as her own over and above the master slave. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, so much for that wonderful lecture. I mean, as always, we are mesmerized by your very close textual readings. So I will straight away go into the Q&A because we have to get in Kevin after this and Kevin unfortunately is not too well, so we can't keep him waiting. Sharnoda, Devulina, you can sort of frame your questions. Falguni, if you have any questions, you can post to ma'am. I was just thinking about in this whole idea of temporality and trauma in the texts of Toni Morrison. The reason why I'm thinking it is because of the fact that Homi Bhabha says that trauma is a kind of a remediation with the past.
Absolutely.
It's not simply going back to the past, but it's a constant remediation, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We are constantly negotiating with the trauma through a very diurnal concept of times. It's not a very chronic, it's not a let's say a very what should I say, a very linear idea of time at all, but time coming back through trauma. So when we are thinking, so when beloved perhaps thinks back at that moment when she had killed her baby,
Absolutely.
and and that moment that when she says that she will not live like I had. I think she's constantly remediating her trauma, and that trauma gets a very corporeal ideation in the novel. So I think I was wondering if you can comment on that maybe.
Yes, it's a brilliant observation, Nilanjan. Thank you for your observation and question. Time plays a very important role in all of Morrison's narratives, and particularly so in a novel like Beloved, because time has a very intricate relation with collective memory. Because if you look at the epigraph of the novel, it's to those millions of people who went through the Middle Passage, and the figure of beloved is just a kind of uh, appropriation of the many psychological and physical injuries that those slaves had felt and also underwent in the plantations. Time is very important precisely because it deals with historical time. There's a lot of historicity associated with these entire process of torture, and sets way of, as you very rightly pointed out, citing Homi Bhabha, revisits the collective memory of suffering of this is entire historical process of being a slave, and she tries to negotiate it through the individual act of the killing of the child, and comes across to the readers as a nurturing but a devouring mother. It's very ironical that time plays a very important role. You have read the novel, you know how Seth remembers the absence of her own biological mother, and how her African mother showed her the the marks of violence on her body and said that this is what you have to live with. Now, if she has to live with
Mm,
this also as a continuation of
mm,
that time, then she has to do it only by revisiting time, by sort of confronting time and the experience associated with it through some act of violence, which is not intentionally done, but that is the only thing that she could do at that moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I was just having this conversation with Falguni, my dear brother, that whether violence can actually counter violence. If he has a question, he can. But Devolina, if you have a question, please pose it to ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. So, first of all, thank you for that wonderful session, ma'am.
Yeah.
My question is very generic. You were talking about the Jim Crow era and all. So, my question is how do literary texts, particularly American literary texts that center racial violence, how do they complicated the concept of nation as a bonded unit? Because as soon as we're talking about racial violence, we're bringing in plural genealogies of race and migration and diaspora.
Mm, right. Now, um, this is a very beautiful question, Debolina, and thank you once again for the question. Now, the idea of the nation for the African Americans is very ambiguous. Precisely, as you know, because they are tossed in between a no man's land in terms of their orientation to the space of origin, which is Africa, and to their space of living, which is America, which has been pointed out by Du Bois in the fact of the double consciousness or the strivings of the one to be a Negro and yet an American. So the idea of a nation and narration, if I may call it, comes in a very complicated and problematized way in various narratives. One good example of this can be cited in the form of Alice Walker's The Color Purple. In The Color Purple, you find, if you go back to the text, that the two sisters, the younger one visits the Ulinka community in Africa, and when she visits, she says, I mean, I'm not actually quoting, but sort of paraphrasing, black people like us, blacker than us. You know, there is a sense of identification and repulsion, and then she never had an idea that black people like them, their skin color black, can inhabit a space beyond the continent of America. And there the question of nationhood is also coming, where she doesn't know where she exactly belongs, because these people speak in a different language and have different cultural practices, but they are quite similar to the black people over here. And here we have the insider outsider dichotomy also, where she's happens to be an insider of the American community, but an outsider looking at the members of the same race but different country from a completely different perspective. And in a way, Walker problematizes. There's a brilliant essay on this in the in Harold Bloom's anthology, where the concept of nation and nationhood, self-definition, belongingness, narrating that is brought out. But this is a very apt query.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank
Yes,
you so much.
sure. Thank you, ma'am. Sharnoda, yes, yes.
Yes. Ma'am, so good to see you, first of all.
Very nice to see you
And
also, Karuna.
uh, that, like those undergraduate days, I was actually taking notes of your
Oh,
class, and
no,
trust my
noted.
words, yes, yes, I have actually written down CB before starting off my notes. just like my undergraduate days, ma'am. Ma'am, first of all, the exhilaratingly enlightening lecture that we have had from you. I just have one question, ma'am. Whenever I read or I teach Toni Morrison, I always have this feeling that she's actually trying to create a different paradigm of affect altogether. The accepted paradigms of affect that has been taught to us. We are kind of conditioned to come up with certain emotional responses, certain manifestations of responses, which, I mean, do not go hand in hand with the experience that the Black Americans have been subjected to.
Yes.
It requires a different set of response, so to say. The the affect is completely different, something that we do not understand. We would never understand since we haven't gone through that experience ourselves. Forget about the whites; they would never be able to imagine the trauma, the hardship, and and how it conditions our affect. I'm so reminded of Sarah Ahmed here, who, in a cultural politics of emotion, says that we need to analyze uh, these affects with their nuances, and we just cannot map the accepted domains and algorithms of affects on on the blacks, on the oppressed, on the people on whom violence has been perpetrated for generations, for millennia together. I'd like to listen to your thoughts on this now.
No, this is again a very good question, and it is very, very relevant. In fact, we can probably on a different platform also share my students' responses of teaching Toni Morrison in an Indian classroom. Now, the question of marginalization theory, race theory, affect theory, at a later on in their post graduation, or probably those who are doing their PhDs, they are exposed to it. They use these theories also very effectively in their works. What I feel is, I would talk a little bit about my experience in JNU. My idea of Africa, or even the Black Americans, till I really read this text at my master's level, was that of Africa was the dark continent, consisted of certain tribes with, these colorful headgears. And of course, cricket was very famous in Africa, and it was those African Maasais and the great, animals in the jungles and the lions in South Africa and those safaris. I had no idea. I'm so sorry that I didn't know till then what um, African American literature was all about, or African writings in English was all about. Of course, I'd read about colonialism and imperialism and everything, but something like maybe Alan Paton, "Cry the Beloved Country," or maybe Conrad. Actually, I was so annoyed with Conrad because whatever. But Conrad in Heart of Darkness, or some African stories. But once, and I remember my guru, my teacher, Dr. H.C. Narang, who introduced me to African literature, introduced our class to African literature, to African poetics, to African American critical theory, to post colonial theory. And he told at that time that, it is not possible for you, exactly what you're saying, Sharon, no, to imagine, the atrocities, the violence, the sadnesses, the marginalization that were inflicted upon these people. And it is not the sadness of being only a minority. It is the sadness, huge collection of people who are being extricated from any kind of normal human exchange. Even today, I'm sorry to say, but there are many
Yes.
very many instances of racial violence in America, even after uh, Barack Obama did so much for the nation. But this happens because, as you rightly say, it is embedded in the consciousness of the white people, because they associate the white with certain attributes of culture, of empowerment, of spirituality, of civilization, and the blacks with all the opposite attributes. And they do not and cannot acknowledge the fact that they are capable of anything significant, though now there's a lot of induction. But that mindset is definitely there, and indeed it affects us differently. We, as Indian readers, would probably try to grip at the in a way that partition literature, when where they were shifted, when they were large masses of people, the influx of people who were refugees, that kind of displacement, dislocation is there. But this is also not just because of a piece of land or a territory, but because of one's racial identity, one's skin color, one's identity. When put to question, it becomes very, very difficult, very hard, and not one or two people disliking you. The entire nation resists your attempts to, sort of. And that is why when Morrison represents this, of course, by now, after teaching, and my MPhil was also on African literature, my PhD was on Toni Morrison and Buchi Amichita. After sort of internalizing snippets of that sadness, I probably I have come to a position when I can understand what it means to be, to some extent, and I try to be as empathetic. I always tell my students, do not extend sympathy, be empathetic to their concerns. I show them films like 12 Years as a Slave and Moonlight, and of course, the first Spielberg version of The Color Purple, and read out from, make them listen to jazz music. So don't say black literature. Oh, what is it? Oh, it's a big fad to do African American theory and literature. That's become very popular. That's okay. But I would say that black people are the greatest singers, the greatest athletes, the greatest nation builders, great physicists. So in that way, to inspire jazz music, I play in class. I play Frank Sinatra. I play other people and the black singers who are outstanding and so popular. Many popular singers, Michael Jackson, people with whom they can connect. Great, I say, watch Denzel Washington, watch Morgan Freeman. Okay, watch Oprah Winfrey shows. See how they have. Watch To Serve With Love. Okay, watch them perform and bring out the best. This is how you can sort of.
Yeah, isn't it? I mean, we'll have to close the session now, but just one or two observations on this brilliant presentation by ma'am. One, of course, is, Sharunoda was talking about this effect, isn't it? The problem is that when there is a systemic hatred
Yes.
against an individual,
Yes, yes. This is
I have to say this in Hindi. I have to say this in Hindi. Bhai, bahut dard hota hai.
Ah,
Bahut
true
dard
it
hota
is. True it is. Very true.
hai. Till you actually go through that experience of being systematically hated for who you are, you will never know what it means.
Maybe the
You know what it
Dalit
means,
experience, Nilanjan.
Yeah.
Maybe the
Yes, ma'am.
Dalit
Dalit
experience,
experience, the
Dalit
gender
literature, but it's
experience, the
gender experience.
I mean,
Okay, but
I
still,
went to New York, yeah, Homi Bhabha was talking about this whole problem of minoritization,
yeah,
gender
yeah,
minoritization,
yes, yes,
minoritization in terms of race, sexuality. There are so many agencies of,
absolutely.
just one little point, Babu, here to this. This whole transcript of George Floyd who was killed, this is so important. Just 2 or 3 years back, George Floyd was killed
Yes,
during,
yes,
it
yes.
was a black man who was killed by
Yeah,
a white
yeah,
policeman.
yeah, yeah.
There's
White
a whole
policeman.
transcript
Yeah.
of that, and George Floyd constantly says, "Sir, I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
I can't
I
be.
can't
He's
breathe."
stamping his
Yes,
foot on his
yes,
heart,
yes,
and this is just
absolutely.
unimaginable.
And repeatedly, George Floyd says, "I can't breathe." And I think that is such a huge metaphor of
Absolutely,
who we are as minorities, whatever
absolutely.
minorities that we all are.
Absolutely.
That's the psychosomatic condition. It's the
Very true.
psychosoma is such that that you actually feel a physical pain when you are actually not in pain.
Absolutely.
That's the heaviness of
Absolutely.
existence.
Absolutely.
Anyways, we have to leave now because
Yes.
Kevin, I guess, is waiting and is not too well, so we'll have to get him in. Thank you so much, ma'am, and
Thank
it's
you.
always an
Thank
honor
you
and
so
privilege
much. It's my pleasure.
to host
And
you.
you will also come to our
Thank
college
you, ma'am.
to present
Yeah,
papers. Thank you so very
sure.
much,
Thank you.
Develina.